Hello and welcome to KLM Institute.
Today, we're diving into a topic that has been causing a lot of buzz in the world of global trade, economics, and politics: the growing dependence of countries on the United States and the potential for those countries to start distancing themselves from U.S. influence. As we all know, the U.S. is an economic powerhouse that has a significant impact on the global stage. But with recent tensions in international trade and politics, many nations are beginning to explore the possibility of a world without full reliance on the U.S. economy. So, let's take a closer look at how countries around the world depend on the U.S. and why the idea of boycotting or reducing dependence on America is becoming more plausible. To start, let's talk about the interdependent relationships that exist between the U.S. and many other countries. The U.S. is one of the world's largest consumer markets, which means that many countries rely on American spending to fuel their economies. Take China, for example. It exports a significant portion of its goods to the U.S., including electronics, apparel, and machinery. Without the U.S. market, China would face a serious economic downturn. Similarly, Germany heavily depends on U.S. consumers purchasing high-end cars from brands like BMW and Mercedes-Benz. These countries, and many more, are tied to the U.S. economy in ways that are hard to ignore.
We're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars if I get elected. Now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it.
Moreover, the technological prowess of the U.S. is unparalleled. We're talking about companies like Google, Microsoft, Apple, and OpenAI, which have become indispensable for businesses and consumers alike all over the world. Think about it. India and many other nations rely on U.S. tech for cloud computing, software solutions, and hardware products. And don't forget the U.S. military, which provides security guarantees to countries such as South Korea, Japan, and NATO allies. These nations depend on the U.S. for protection, especially in times of global instability. So, the question arises: how can countries reduce this dependence on the U.S., especially in light of threats such as President Trump's warning that he could impose a 100% tariff on goods and services from nations that challenge America? Well, the answer could lie in the creation of a new, independent financial system and a common currency. For years, countries have been discussing the idea of forming a trade bloc that could bypass the US dollar. Imagine a world where countries no longer rely on the U.S. to settle their international transactions. The dream of a common currency could become a reality if countries in regions like Europe, Asia, and Africa start working together to create alternatives to the U.S. dollar. Countries like China and Russia have already started moving away from using the dollar in trade, particularly in the energy sector. They have been conducting transactions in their local currencies, like the Chinese yuan and the Russian ruble. Other nations, especially in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, are following suit. For example, Saudi Arabia, a country that has long traded oil in US dollars, is exploring options to sell oil in other currencies. This move signals a shift toward economic diversification and reducing reliance on the US dollar. But the concept of a new currency doesn't stop there. The BRICS countries Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have been leading the charge. They're exploring the possibility of creating a BRICS-backed digital currency or strengthening existing payment systems that would allow these nations to settle transactions without using the dollar. For example, China has developed the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, which allows for trade to be conducted using the yuan. This is a critical step in reducing global reliance on the US-dominated SWIFT system. If these countries continue to push forward with this vision, we could see a global shift in how trade is conducted, with an emphasis on using regional currencies instead of the US dollar.
India, which is a very big abuser, we tax them. And they tax us. Almost in all cases, they're taxing us, and we haven't been taxing them. Tariffs will make our country rich. Properly used.
Совокупный ВВП объединения составляет более 6 продолжает расти.
The next question is, what's stopping this dream of a common currency from becoming a reality? Well, there are a few challenges. One of the biggest hurdles is the economic and political differences between the countries involved. For example, BRICS nations, although united in some ways, have diverse economic structures and political ideologies. A country like China, with its booming economy, has different If more countries begin adopting CBDCs, we could see a decentralized method of international trade that doesn't rely on traditional financial systems. This could be a game changer in terms of reducing US influence over global finance. But here's the kicker. Even as countries start exploring these alternatives, they must also come up with alternatives to American companies that dominate the global market. Imagine a world where countries don't rely on companies like Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, Boeing, or Apple. These tech giants have become deeply embedded in the daily lives of billions of people around the world. If countries want to break free from the US grip, they'll need to develop their own versions of these services and technologies. For instance, Europe could focus on boosting its own tech companies to challenge the likes of Google and Facebook. In Asia, companies like Tencent or Alibaba could grow even more influential, providing alternatives to American giants. Meanwhile, nations could start investing heavily in defense technologies and building alliances to reduce their reliance on US military support. This would require significant investments in research, development, and collaboration between countries. As for the global trade system, diplomatic efforts will play a crucial role. While countries might not be able to sever their ties with the US overnight, they can start advocating for fairer global trade policies. This could be done through international organizations like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the G20. Countries could push for reforms that ensure trade decisions aren't disproportionately controlled by one nation. So, how would these countries deal with the very real threat of a 100% tariff from the US? First, they would need to negotiate trade deals that reduce their dependence on the US market. The EU, for example, could expand trade with countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to create new, diversified markets. China and India could also look for ways to strengthen economic ties with these regions. This would help mitigate the impact of potential US tariffs. The bottom line is that boycotting the US entirely is unlikely to happen in the short term. The global economy is deeply intertwined with the US, and completely cutting ties would have far-reaching consequences. However, by taking gradual steps, such as forming new trade agreements, developing alternative financial systems, and investing in new technologies, countries can start to reduce their reliance on the US over time. It won't be an easy process, but as the world becomes more interconnected, the idea of creating an independent global financial system and reducing dependence on US influence is becoming more and more plausible. This is the direction in which global trade is heading, and it will be fascinating to see how countries come together to challenge the status quo. The future of international trade and finance could look very different from what we know today. What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. Stay tuned to KLM Institute for more insights on this evolving topic. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.